There is a 40-second moment in Season 10 of Family Guy where Meg Griffin looks her father directly in the face and tells him, with complete accuracy, that he is a waste of a man. She names specific things. She has evidence. She is not wrong about a single word she says. Peter Griffin's response is to turn to his wife and ask her to make Meg stop. That response, that specific and total failure to feel anything real about an honest description of yourself, was predicted. Not by a television critic, not by a psychologist, by a philosopher named Friedrich Nietzsche, who died in 1900, almost a full century before Family Guy put Peter Griffin in that recliner for the first time. Nietzsche warned us that modern life was producing a specific kind of person, comfortable, directionless, incapable of genuine growth, content to repeat the same day forever and call it living. He called this person the last man, and he described him so precisely that Seth MacFarlane may as well have used the description as a character Bible. Welcome to Red Umbrella. Let's get into it. The last man has a beer and a recliner. There is a moment in Season 4 of Family Guy where Peter Griffin sits in a doctor's office and gets told, officially, with paperwork and everything, that he is legally, mentally disabled. His IQ has been tested. The number came back at 70. The doctor explains this clearly. Peter processes it for about 4 seconds. Then he realizes he can use it to get away with things. And that is his entire response to learning something true and devastating about himself. Not sadness, not determination, not even denial. Really, just the fastest possible route to comfort. That moment is not just funny. It is one of the most accidentally precise things Family Guy has ever put on screen. Because there is a philosopher named Friedrich Nietzsche who lived in the 1800s and spent a significant portion of his career warning the world about exactly this kind of person. Not a criminal, not a monster. Something he found far more disturbing than either of those things. He called this person the last man. Nietzsche wrote a book called Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and in it, a character named Zarathustra comes down from a mountain to share his ideas with regular people. Nobody wants to hear them, so Zarathustra tries a different approach. He decides to show the crowd something so small, so empty, so genuinely sad, that it will shock them into wanting something better. He describes the last man, and the crowd does not react with horror. They cheer. They say, "Give us this. Make us into this. You can keep your higher ideals. We want the last man." That scene from Nietzsche's book was written in the 1880s. Family Guy premiered in 1999. And yet, every time Peter Griffin cracks open a Pawtucket Patriot Ale, drops into his recliner, and stares at the television with an expression somewhere between contentment and a stopped clock, Nietzsche's warning plays out in real time in front of millions of viewers who find it deeply, genuinely comforting. That is what this essay is about. Not whether Peter Griffin is a bad person. Not whether Family Guy is a bad show. Something more specific, and, if you sit with it, more unsettling. Peter Griffin is not a satire of the last man. He is not a warning about the last man. He is the last man. Fully formed, faithfully rendered, and beloved by an audience that watched Zarathustra's crowd make their choice and then made exactly the same one.
So before we get into what Peter specifically does and why it maps so perfectly onto a 140-year-old philosophical prediction, we need to understand what the last man actually is. Because Nietzsche was not using the phrase loosely, and the fit between his description and the man who lives at 31 Spooner Street in Quahog, Rhode Island, is not a coincidence. It is a portrait. The last man, according to Nietzsche, is the final destination of a society that has decided comfort is the highest goal. Not happiness, exactly. Not peace. Comfort. The specific absence of difficulty. The last man takes no risks. He avoids pain at all costs. He has no great passion, no large dream, nothing he would sacrifice anything meaningful for. He lives the same day over and over and considers this a success because the day was not painful. He has, in his own estimation, discovered happiness. He blinks when he tells you this, Nietzsche says. The blinking is important. It is the physical expression of a mind that has stopped reaching. The last man does not hate life. He is too tired for that. He does not rage against his circumstances or burn with frustration or push against anything. He just sits. He earns enough money to stay warm. He has mild entertainments. He has a small group of friends who are also last men, and together they share the same mild entertainments and do not challenge each other to be anything more than what they already are. He is not evil. He is not stupid, exactly, though he is not curious either. He is something Nietzsche found harder to forgive than either of those things. He is satisfied. Now, Peter Griffin. Peter Griffin is a large man who lives in a fictional town in Rhode Island with his wife Lois, his 3 children Meg, Chris, and Stewie, and a talking dog named Brian. He works at a brewery called Pawtucket Patriot, where his job title changed over the seasons, but his level of engagement with the work never did. He spends his evenings at a a bar called the Drunken Clam with 3 friends, Quagmire, Cleveland, and Joe. He watches a lot of television. He drinks a lot of beer. He has a recliner that functions less like a piece of furniture and more like a life philosophy. In Season 4, Episode 6, which is called Petarded, Peter wins a game of Trivial Pursuit and becomes convinced he is a genius. The reason he won, which he does not know, is that Lois secretly swapped his question cards for the preschool edition. He was answering questions designed for 4-year-olds and thought he was demonstrating exceptional intelligence. Brian, who finds this unbearable to watch, challenges Peter to actually take an IQ test. Peter takes the test. The result is a score of 70, which places him in the range that is formally classified as intellectual disability. A professor explains this to him using a chart. Peter's name sits below the line that says mentally disabled. Peter is upset for approximately 1 scene. Then he runs his car into a local news anchor named Tom Tucker and realizes that nobody is going to hold a legally mentally disabled man responsible for running someone over. And that is when the episode becomes philosophically interesting. Because what Peter discovers in that moment is not a path to growth or self-understanding. What he discovers is a new and more efficient route to 0 consequences. He uses his diagnosis to walk into women's bathrooms. He uses it to harass people in restaurants. He uses it as armor against every possible form of accountability. The truth about himself, the real and documented truth, becomes a tool for staying exactly as he is. This is the last man's relationship with self-knowledge. Nietzsche believed that the ability to look at yourself honestly and find yourself lacking was not just painful, but necessary. It was the starting point for everything that might make a person worth being. The technical word for this is self-overcoming, but you can call it simply the capacity to grow. The last man does not have this capacity. Not because he is stupid, though he may be, but because growth requires wanting something more than you currently have. And the last man wants nothing more than he currently has. He is, in his own estimation, already fine. In Petarded, the show essentially hands Peter a mirror and says, "Look at yourself." And Peter looks and sees his reflection and asks, "What can I use this for?" That is the last man's response to every truth the world offers him. Not confrontation, not change, extraction. What can I get out of this that requires the least possible effort on my part? Now, some people watching this essay might argue that Peter is not really the last man, because the last man, as Nietzsche described him, is passive, and Peter is anything but passive. Peter blows things up. Peter starts feuds. Peter goes on adventures every single week. He is loud and chaotic and constantly moving. This is a fair point, and it deserves a real answer. The last man is not passive in the sense of doing nothing. He is passive in the sense of never doing anything that requires him to grow. There is a difference between motion and direction. Peter creates enormous amounts of chaos in every episode, but none of it is in service of becoming anything. His schemes are always in the direction of more comfort, more respect, more fun, more attention. They are never in the direction of being better. He does not set out in any episode to become wiser, more capable, more honest, or more connected to anything that matters. He sets out to feel good, and the chaos is just the method he uses to try to get there. And this is the distinction that matters. Nietzsche's Übermensch, the ideal that the last man is the opposite of, is not a person who does impressive things. He is a person who creates meaning and then grows into it. He is defined by direction, not just movement. Peter Griffin has enormous amounts of movement and no direction at all. Every episode ends with the situation reset to where it started. This is not a coincidence of animated television. The show is telling you something true about Peter. He cannot change because he does not want to. He wants the recliner and the beer and the television, and every adventure he goes on is ultimately about getting back to those things. Nietzsche describes the last man as someone who has bred out of himself the capacity for great passion and great commitment. Someone who merely earns a living and keeps warm. Look at Peter's actual life. He works at a brewery, not because beer means something to him, but because it is the job he has. He is married to Lois, not because he has thought carefully about partnership and love, but because that is who he is married to. He has 3 children, and while the early seasons show moments of genuine warmth, the later seasons reveal something the show probably did not intend to reveal. Peter is a man for whom his own children are largely an afterthought when they are not in direct service of his immediate needs. Keeping warm, earning enough, not rocking the boat. Nietzsche predicted that the society of the last man would be too empty to produce great individuals anymore, not because greatness had been actively destroyed, destroyed, but because the soil it needed to grow had been worn down to nothing by the constant, gentle pressure of good enough. Peter Griffin is not the destruction of anything great. He is what happens to the soil after generations of good enough.
He is the endpoint, wearing a shirt with a collar stain, holding a beer he did not have to earn, watching television he did not choose, in a house that happened to him. And the reason it is worth spending an entire essay on this is not to make fun of Peter. It is to take seriously what the show is showing us when it puts him on screen and asks us to love him. Because we do. That is the part that Nietzsche would have found both predictable and horrifying. Zarathustra shows the crowd the last man, expecting them to be disgusted. They applaud. They want it. Peter Griffin has been on television for over 2 decades, and the audience has never stopped watching. The memes are everywhere. The merchandise exists. The voice is recognizable to people who have never seen a single episode. We were shown the last man. We made him a star. And that choice, that specific audience response to a specific kind of character, is exactly what Nietzsche was warning us about. But if Peter Griffin is the last man in the broadest sense, the question the rest of this essay needs to answer is what exactly that means in practice. Because Nietzsche's warning was not vague. He gave the last man specific characteristics. He described what he does, what he cannot do, how he treats the people around him, how he responds to pain, how he relates to meaning. And Peter Griffin hits every single one of those marks in ways that are documented, specific, and tied to real moments in the show. __quote _0 ___. The most interesting place to start is with Peter's relationship with the truth about himself, because what Petarded shows us in its first 5 minutes, what it reveals before any of the comedy lands, is a man who cannot despise himself. And according to Nietzsche, that inability is not a personality quirk. It is the thing that makes everything else impossible. That is where we are going next. Section 2. The man who can't despise himself. There is a line in Nietzsche's writing that sounds almost like a riddle the first time you read it. He says that the most despicable man is he that is no longer able to despise himself. Read it again, and it stops being a riddle. It becomes a diagnosis. What Nietzsche means is this: the ability to look at yourself and feel genuine dissatisfaction, real, honest discomfort with who you are and what you are doing is not a weakness. It is the engine of every good thing a person can become. You cannot fix what you refuse to see. You cannot grow past a version of yourself you have decided is already acceptable. The person who looks at their own reflection and finds nothing worth changing is not confident. They are stuck, and they will stay stuck forever, because the one thing that could move them, the honest recognition that they need to move, is the one thing they cannot access. Nietzsche called this capacity for honest self-dissatisfaction a form of strength. Not the strength that shows up in muscles or loud voices, but the quieter and rarer strength of being willing to be uncomfortable with yourself. The man who can feel that discomfort and sit with it and let it push him forward is the man who can become something. The man who cannot feel it, or who immediately converts it into something more comfortable, is the man who stays exactly where he is until he dies. Peter Griffin cannot despise himself, not in any lasting or meaningful way. And the show proves this not once, but over and over across more than 2 decades, in ways that are specific and documented and impossible to explain away as just the requirements of a comedy reset. The clearest single proof is Petarded, but the proof runs deeper than the episode's most obvious joke. Go back to the beginning of that episode. Peter is at game night with his neighbors. Lois, knowing her husband and wanting him to have a good time, has quietly swapped his Trivial Pursuit cards for the preschool edition. Peter wins. Peter immediately becomes insufferable. He starts talking down to everyone at the table, explaining things to them, positioning himself as the smartest person in the room. He has won 1 round of a children's game, using questions designed for 4-year-olds, and he has already decided this confirms something he suspected about himself, that he is exceptional. This is the foundation. Before any diagnosis, before any IQ test, before any of the comedy that follows, the episode shows you exactly who Peter Griffin is in his baseline state. He is a man whose self-image is completely disconnected from any evidence about who he actually is. He does not need to have done anything to feel good about himself. He needs only to have won something, anything, under any conditions, and he will immediately construct a version of himself that the win confirms. The preschool Trivial Pursuit cards are not just a setup for the joke. They are a precise description of the bar Peter requires to feel superior. Brian, who has sat across from this man for years and has apparently reached his limit, challenges Peter to take a real IQ test. Not to be cruel, or not only to be cruel, but because the inflation of Peter's self-image is genuinely difficult to tolerate when you are sober. Peter agrees, because in his mind, the test is simply going to confirm what he already knows. He goes to the doctor's office and takes the assessment. He uses a children's
Children see and say toy as a calculator. The test results come back. His IQ is 70. The doctor uses a chart to explain this to him, and the chart places Peter's name beneath the line marked mentally disabled. Now here is the moment the essay needs to stop at, because this is where a person with any capacity for genuine self-reflection would have a real experience. Not necessarily a dramatic one, not necessarily a complete breakdown, but some version of contact with a difficult truth. Some moment where the gap between who you thought you were and who the evidence says you are produces something real in you. Peter has no such moment. What he has instead is a brief period of being bummed out, and then he runs his car into Tom Tucker, the local news anchor. Tom Tucker recognizes Peter as, and this is a direct quote from the episode, the retarded fellow.
And Tom Tucker lets him go without calling the police, because you cannot hold a mentally disabled man responsible for running someone over. And in that single exchange, Peter's entire relationship with the truth about himself is revealed. He is not sad about what he learned. He is not motivated by it. He is not humbled. He has simply located the angle. The diagnosis, the real and documented truth about who he is now a resource. He is going to use it. What follows in the episode is Peter systematically walking into situations he previously could not access without consequence, and accessing them. He enters the women's bathroom and gets caught. He apologizes by indicating he has a disability, and the women let it go. He continues. He tells people in a restaurant, as loudly as possible, something that has no bearing on anything.
He walks through his neighborhood with new confidence. Not the confidence of someone who has understood something and grown from it, but the confidence of someone who has found a loophole. The episode is being played as comedy, and it works as comedy, but what it is actually showing you is a man who was handed the most direct and uncomfortable self-knowledge imaginable, and immediately converted it into fuel for staying exactly who he already is. The truth did not move him. It armed him. Nietzsche wrote extensively about what happens when a person cannot make honest contact with their own failings. He called it one of the defining features of the last man. The last man does not lie to himself exactly. He simply does not look. And when the world forces him to look, when a doctor hands him a piece of paper that says his IQ is 70, he processes it as quickly as possible and redirects his attention toward whatever is most immediately comfortable. Now here is where the Family Guy evidence gets richer, because petarded is not a one-time event. It is the sharpest single example of a pattern that runs through the entire show. In Seahorse Seashell Party, which is season 10, episode 2, Meg Griffin does something extraordinary. Trapped in the house during a hurricane with no television, with nothing to distract anyone from actually being present with each other, Meg finally breaks. She has been on the receiving end of her family's cruelty for years at this point, mostly from Peter, but distributed across everyone, and she has had enough. She turns to her father and delivers what is probably the most honest description of Peter Griffin in the show's entire run. She says, "You have no education, you have no interests, you just do whatever reckless thing you want, whenever you want, without regard for anyone else." She says, "You are a fat, lazy, abusive, blue-collar, Irish Catholic dad who drinks way too much and barely makes enough to support his family." She says, "Take a good look at yourself, Peter Griffin. You are a waste of a man." This is not a throwaway line. The show has written a character delivering the most direct and accurate appraisal of Peter that any character has ever delivered. Meg is not wrong about anything she says. The show has spent 10 seasons demonstrating that every single thing she says is accurate. This is the mirror Nietzsche describes. This is the moment of uncomfortable self-knowledge arriving from outside when the person cannot produce it from inside. Peter's response is, "Wait a second, these are criticisms." He then turns to Lois and asks her to tell Meg to knock it off. That is it. That is the entire response. Someone has just handed him a portrait of who he actually is, painted with specific and accurate strokes, and his reaction is not reflection, not anger at himself, not even genuine anger at her. It is mild confusion, followed by an attempt to get someone else to make the uncomfortable things stop. He does not dispute what Meg says. He does not defend himself. He simply identifies that these are criticisms and indicates that he would prefer they not be happening. This is Nietzsche's observation playing out in 22 minutes of animated television. The man who cannot despise himself does not argue when shown the truth. He does not even get properly upset. He gets inconvenienced. And then he tries to return to whatever position was most comfortable before the inconvenience arrived. And then the episode does something that is either a deeply cynical creative choice or an accidentally brilliant piece of storytelling, depending on how you look at it. Meg's speech works. It causes the family to turn on each other instead of on her. And for a brief moment, everyone is being honest about everyone. And then Meg watches the family implode without her as the target, and she makes a decision. She apologizes. She takes it back. She goes back to being the lightning rod. She decides, consciously,
purposely to absorb the family's dysfunction again, so they can go back to being comfortable. The episode frames this as Meg having a moment of wisdom, a recognition that her role in the family, however painful, serves a purpose. But what it actually shows is the last man's household requiring someone to sacrifice their self-respect so that the last man does not have to develop any. Peter's inability to despise himself creates a vacuum, and someone has to fill it. Meg fills it every episode.
Because if nobody is absorbing the discomfort of being the family's punching bag, the discomfort has nowhere to go, and the family breaks apart. The last man's comfort is not free. Someone is always paying for it. There is another layer to this that the show does not spell out, but that the evidence supports. Peter's relationship with self-knowledge is not just limited to the dramatic moments. It is structural. TV tropes document something called Aesop amnesia in the Family Guy entry, which describes how Peter learns a lesson at the end of an episode and has completely forgotten it by the start of the next one. This is partially a feature of how animated comedies work, where each episode resets so the next one can happen. But it is also, whether the writers intended it or not, a perfect behavioral description of the man Nietzsche was warning about. Growth requires memory. You cannot become something better if you cannot hold on to the recognition that you needed to become better. Peter cannot hold on to that recognition. It does not stick. Every lesson dissolves by the next episode, leaving him exactly as he was, sitting in the recliner, opening a beer, having learned nothing because nothing learned is allowed to change who he is. He is not capable of lasting self-despair because he is not capable of lasting self-awareness. The two things are connected. You cannot feel the discomfort of who you are if you cannot maintain a clear enough picture of who you are to compare it against anything. The show has tested this in multiple ways across its run. Peter has been told he is a bad father. He has been told he is a bad husband. He has been told he is a bad friend. He has had these things demonstrated to him through consequences that were direct and unavoidable. In certain early episodes, the show built genuine emotional moments around Peter recognizing something true and trying to do better. The season 2 episode where Peter works to do right by Meg, the moments of real warmth between Peter and Lois in the first few seasons, the occasional glimpse of a man who could, under different circumstances, be something more than what he is. Those moments matter for the essay's argument because they show that Peter's inability to despise himself is not simply the result of the show's writers deciding he should be this way. It is a trajectory. There was a version of Peter who made some contact with himself. The show moved away from that version deliberately, deepening his self-satisfaction and widening the gap between who he is and who he could honestly recognize himself to be. The man got worse, and the audience kept watching. Nietzsche's warning was not that the last man was born this way. It was that this is where a person ends up when the pressure of life is slowly removed, when the consequences of not growing are made comfortable enough that the growing becomes optional. Peter Griffin's life is structured to make his self-satisfaction entirely sustainable. Lois handles the things he will not handle. Brian is the conscience he can ignore. Meg absorbs what he cannot face. The show has built around him a support system that makes his inability to despise himself completely livable. He never has to change because the world has adjusted itself to accommodate him as he is. That is the last man's real secret. He is not possible alone. He requires a structure around him that absorbs the cost of his complacency, so he never has to feel it himself. And once you see that structure in the Griffin household, you cannot unsee it. Every character exists in some relation to Peter's comfort. Every other character has adapted to make his stasis possible, which raises the next question. If Peter cannot despise himself, cannot change, cannot grow, cannot hold on to a single lesson the world tries to teach him, then what is he actually doing in all those episodes where he is running around and making chaos and appearing to want things? What is the engine driving him if it is not the will to become anything? Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The answer to that question has a name too, and it is not ambition, it is not purpose. It is the specific drive that Nietzsche identified as the engine of every man who has given up on becoming and settled for feeling. That is where we are going in Section 3. Section 3. Comfort over everything. The passive nihilist in Quahog. There is a version of giving up that looks nothing like giving up. It does not look like lying in bed. It does not look like refusing to leave the house. It does not look like depression or sadness or the kind of obvious defeat that other people can point to and name. It looks like a man who goes to work, comes home, opens a beer, turns on the television, and calls that a life. It looks like someone who is always moving, always busy, always in the middle of something, but never actually going anywhere. It looks, if you squint, almost like contentment. Nietzsche had a name for this version of giving up. He called it passive nihilism, and it is the mode that Peter Griffin lives in for every single episode of Family Guy. To understand passive passive nihilism, you need to understand what nihilism actually is at its most basic. Nihilism is what happens when a person stops believing that anything has real meaning or real value. Not necessarily in a dramatic, announcing it loudly kind of way. Most of the time, it is quieter than that. It is the slow background feeling that nothing you do really matters, that there is no point in reaching for anything difficult, that the whole thing is essentially empty, so you might as well be comfortable while you wait for it to be over. Nietzsche believed nihilism was one of the biggest dangers facing people in the modern world.
Not because he thought it was wrong, exactly, but because he thought it was an unavoidable thing that every serious person would eventually have to walk through. And the question was, what you did on the other side of it. He said there were two possible responses. The first response he called active nihilism. The person who chooses this path looks at the emptiness directly, decides that since nothing has given meaning to the world, he is going to have to build meaning himself, and starts building. He destroys the old values that no longer hold, not out of rage, but out of honesty, and he starts creating new ones. This path is hard and uncomfortable, and requires a person to be in constant motion in a real direction. Nietzsche thought this was the path that led somewhere worth going. The second response he called passive nihilism. The person who takes this path looks at the emptiness, feels it, and then immediately turns away from it toward whatever is nearest and most soothing. He does not build anything, he does not destroy anything with purpose. He just fills the space where meaning used to be with comfort and entertainment and small pleasures in the company of people who are also not going anywhere, and he calls this happiness. He goes through the motions of a life without ever doing the one thing that would make it a life in the truest sense, choosing it. Nietzsche thought passive nihilism was more dangerous than active nihilism, not because it caused more visible damage, but because it was so much easier to live inside. The active nihilist is at least fighting something. The passive nihilist has stopped fighting and decided the couch is fine. Peter Griffin is the passive nihilist in his purest possible form. Look at the structure of a standard Family Guy episode. Peter has a problem, or encounters something new, or gets an idea. He pursues it with enormous, chaotic energy. Things explode. People get hurt. Relationships strain. By the end of the episode, the situation has resolved, usually through luck or the efforts of someone else, and Peter is back where he started. He has learned nothing. He wants nothing different than he wanted at the beginning. The chaos was never in service of any real direction. It was just motion, filling the time between one beer and the next. This is passive nihilism in animated form. The constant activity disguises the total absence of any genuine forward movement. Peter is always doing something, but he is never becoming anything. He is a man in perpetual motion who is going nowhere. The show itself makes this argument without realizing it. In Seahorse Seashell Party, Season 10, Episode 2, Meg delivers her full, honest appraisal of her father during a hurricane that has knocked out the television. Notice why the television being knocked out matters. The family is stuck with each other, with no screen to fill the silence, and within a short time the entire thing collapses into honesty. The television is not just a prop in the Griffin household. It is a comfort delivery system. It is the mechanism by which the passive nihilist fills the hours without having to feel the hours. When it goes out, there is suddenly nothing between the family and themselves. And what they find when they look at each other without the buffer is not warmth. It is accumulated resentment with nowhere to go. Meg says to her father that he has no education and no interests. Both of these things are documented throughout the show. Peter's intelligence was formally assessed in Petarded at an IQ of 70. His education was described in Meg's speech itself as essentially non-existent. But the part that lands hardest from a Nietzsche standpoint is no interests, because interests, real ones, require a person to want something beyond immediate comfort. An interest is a form of reaching. It is the beginning of a direction. Peter has obsessions, certainly. He has gone through phases with various fixations across the seasons, but they are never real interests in the way Meg means. They are comfort in a different shape. They are whatever new thing has entered his attention and is currently providing stimulation. When the stimulation fades, the fixation is abandoned completely, and he goes back to the recliner. This is the passive nihilist's relationship with everything that looks like passion. It is not passion. It is distraction. And the difference between the two is that passion pulls you somewhere, while distraction just fills the space until something else comes along. Peter works at a brewery. He has been a shipping clerk, a fisherman, and a desk worker across the show's run. None of these jobs were chosen. None of them represent anything he decided he wanted for his life. He ended up in them through circumstances and stayed in them because leaving would require a level of intention that passive nihilism cannot produce. He earns enough to keep the house running and fund his trips to the Drunken Clam, and this is sufficient because sufficient is all he is aiming for. The Drunken Clam is worth paying attention to as a location. Peter has sat sat at the same bar with the same three friends, Quagmire, Cleveland, and Joe, for the entire run of the show. They drink. They talk about things that do not matter. They go home. They come back and do it again. This is not friendship in the sense of people helping each other grow or pushing each other toward anything. It is companionship in the sense of mutual stillness. They are comfortable together because none of them requires anything from the others. The bar is a place where the passive nihilist can be around other people without any of the risk that real connection would bring. Nietzsche described the last man as having small pleasures for the day and small pleasures for the night, and being careful with his health. Peter's pleasures are consistent: beer, television, the bar, occasional food fixations, the company of his three friends. He cycles through these things with remarkable consistency. He is careful with nothing, which is where the description does not quite fit on the surface, but the spirit of it holds. He is not growing, he is maintaining. He is doing the minimum required to keep the current arrangement intact and comfortable. The most honest single piece of evidence for Peter's passive nihilism is what the show calls Aesop amnesia. This is the pattern, documented across the entire series, where Peter reaches the end of an episode having apparently learned something, and then begins the next episode having learned nothing. He will spend 22 minutes working through a situation that should, if he were capable of genuine growth, change something in him, and then the next week he is back to exactly who he was. The lesson did not land, because lessons require a person to want to be different, and Peter does not want to be different. He wants things to be comfortable, and once they are comfortable again, the discomfort that produced the lesson is no longer present, and without the discomfort, there is no motivation to hold on to what it taught. This is passive nihilism's cruelest feature. It is self-sustaining. The comfort prevents the growth. The absence of growth means the person keeps needing the comfort, round and round, forever, in a circle that looks from the outside like a life being lived, but from the inside, if the person were ever honest enough to look, would feel like a room with no doors. The distinction between passive and active nihilism is not about whether a person is doing things. It is about whether the things they are doing are connected to any real intention to become something or build something or move in any direction that was chosen rather than just fallen into. Peter does many things. He builds nothing. He moves in no direction. Every adventure begins and ends in the same place. That is not a life being lived. That is a life being repeated. And here is where the essay needs to make a turn that the section on Peter's self-knowledge was pointing toward but could not yet reach. Peter's passive nihilism is not just a personal failing. It has consequences for the people around him. The passive nihilist does not exist in a vacuum. He exists in a family, and a family organized around one person's complete unwillingness to grow or change or want anything difficult has to reorganize itself to absorb that unwillingness. Someone has to carry what Peter will not carry. Someone has to want what Peter will not want. Someone has to feel what Peter will not feel. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Knowing who that someone is and what it costs them tells you more about Peter Griffin than any single episode of the show. But that is a story about a specific Nietzsche idea that goes by a name with a very specific and disturbing meaning, and it is the story that comes next. Section 4. The herd animal who thinks he's the alpha. There is a specific kind of confidence that looks, on the surface, exactly like the real thing. It is loud. It takes up space. It does not apologize. It announces itself constantly and expects the room to respond. And if you are not paying close attention, if you are just watching someone from a distance and noting whether they seem sure of themselves, you might mistake it for genuine strength. Nietzsche would not mistake it. He had a name for it, and he was not kind about it. He called it the confidence of the herd animal. And the difference between that and the real thing is not about volume or boldness or how much space a person takes up in a room. It is about where the confidence comes from. Real confidence, the kind Nietzsche associated with the Übermensch, comes from a person who has built a self through genuine effort and genuine thought. The herd animal's confidence comes from something much simpler and much emptier. It comes from looking around and seeing that everyone nearby is doing the same thing, and deciding that agreement equals correctness and popularity equals worth. Peter Griffin is the herd animal who has decided he is the alpha, and the show demonstrates this not through one episode or one plotline, but through the entire structure of who Peter is and how he moves through the world. Start with the most basic level. Peter's tastes, opinions, and obsessions are entirely shaped by whatever is currently in front of him. He has no stable preferences that he arrived at through thought or genuine experience. He has whatever the television is showing him, whatever his friends are talking about at the bar, whatever the cultural signal closest to him is producing at any given moment. In one episode, he is obsessed with a movie. In the next, he has forgotten it entirely. In one episode, he adopts a new identity based
based on something he encountered that week. By the next episode, the identity is gone. He has no bedrock. He has no thing that is genuinely his, arrived at through genuine reflection that persists across time and circumstance. This is the herd mentality at its most precise. The herd animal does not choose. He absorbs. Whatever the group is doing, whatever the group values, whatever signal is loudest in the environment becomes his signal too. And he does this not because he is consciously following anyone, but because he has never developed the inner machinery required to generate a direction of his own. He moves with whatever is moving around him and calls it living. Now here is the interesting complication with Peter. He does not think of himself as following anyone. He thinks of himself as a leader. He is loud, he is decisive, he initiates, he announces his opinions at full volume without invitation. In his own mind, he is clearly the most important and interesting person in any room he enters. He is not skulking at the back of the herd. He is out front, gesturing at everyone to follow him. But watch where he leads. Every scheme Peter initiates in the show is a response to an external signal, not an internal one. He sees something on television and wants to do it. He hears about something a neighbor has and wants the same thing. He feels that someone has disrespected him and wants to retaliate. He encounters a new idea and immediately needs to be the person most associated with that idea. None of these are directions he chose from a quiet place inside himself. All of them are reactions to something outside. He is leading the charge toward wherever the environment most recently pointed him. This is the herd mentality with a louder voice. The direction still comes from outside. The confidence is still borrowed. The difference between Peter and a quieter herd member is not that Peter is more independent. It is that Peter is more aggressive about following. He does not wait to see what everyone else does. He runs toward whatever external signal he has picked up and acts as though running faster means he chose the direction. Nietzsche wrote about this specific combination, the herd animal who mistakes his own loudness for individuality. He found it particularly common and particularly sad, because the loud version of the herd animal is actually further from genuine independence than the quiet version, not closer. The quiet herd member at least has some awareness that he is following. The loud one has convinced himself he is leading, which means he has no awareness at all that there is something to break free from. Look at Peter's relationship with his three friends, Quagmire, Cleveland, and Joe. This group has been unchanged for the entire run of the show. They sit at the same bar, in the same seats, having recognizably similar conversations, and the dynamic between them has not shifted in any meaningful way in over 20 years of television. Peter is loudest, Peter drives most of the group's activity, and the others respond to him. This looks, from a certain angle, like leadership, but nothing in this group pushes any of them anywhere. Nobody in the Drunken Clam is asking hard questions. Nobody is challenging anyone else to want something more. The group exists as a comfort system, a place where each of them can be exactly who he currently is, without any pressure to examine whether that is who he should be. Peter is the loudest person in a group that has collectively decided not to grow, which makes him the leader of exactly nothing. Nietzsche described the herd as a group that moves together not because they have chosen a common direction, but because movement itself is more comfortable than stillness, and moving with others is more comfortable than moving alone. The Drunken Clam is this idea in a physical location. The four of them move together through their weeks and their years, covering ground that goes in a circle, and the circle is comfortable enough that none of them has felt the need to break out of it. Now look at what happens when Peter encounters someone who has actually built something. When Peter meets a person with genuine expertise, or genuine accomplishment, or a life that was clearly constructed through real effort and real intention, one of two things happens. He either tries immediately to beat them at what they do, or he tries immediately to absorb their identity and become them. Both responses are the herd animal's response to encountering the real thing. You cannot appreciate what you cannot understand, and you cannot understand independence when you have never experienced it. So you compete with it, or you copy it. Peter does both, often in the same episode. This pattern runs across the whole series. Peter encounters a man who is successful and becomes obsessed with that man. Peter meets someone who has a skill and immediately needs to either have that skill or defeat the person who has it. He cannot simply observe and appreciate. That would require the kind of settled inner self that looks at another person's genuine achievement and says, that is theirs and it is good. Peter does not have a settled inner self. He has a continuously shifting surface that reflects back whatever is currently nearest to it. His narcissism, which the show documents explicitly, and which has been
analyzed in multiple formal psychological breakdowns of his character, is not the narcissism of someone who has built a self and values it too highly. It is the narcissism of someone who has no stable self and therefore needs constant external confirmation that they exist and matter. Every time Peter seeks attention, which is constantly, he is not demonstrating confidence. He is revealing the absence of it. Real confidence does not need to be seen. The herd animal cannot survive without being seen, because being seen is the only thing that makes him feel real. Season 4, Episode 6, Petarded, shows this in its opening minutes. Peter wins a children's game using children's questions and immediately needs everyone at the table to acknowledge his genius. He cannot simply feel good about winning. He needs to extract from the room around him a confirmation that the win means something about who he is. This is not the behavior of a man who knows who he is. It is the behavior of a man who is desperately asking the room to tell him. And when the room gives him the opposite of that confirmation, when Brian challenges him and the test comes back with an IQ of 70, Peter does not sit with the new information long enough to integrate it. He converts it as fast as possible into something that still allows him to feel confirmed. The disability becomes a tool for getting away with things. Getting away with things feels like power. Feeling powerful is the closest Peter can get to the confirmation he was originally looking for. The method changes. The need never does. This is the herd animal's deepest problem. The need for external confirmation never goes away because it is filling in for something that was never built internally. Peter will always need the room to respond to him. He will always need his friends to laugh. He will always need to be the one who is talked about, referenced, centered. Not because he is vain in the simple sense, but because vanity is what the herd animal builds when he has no genuine self to stand on. It is a structure made of other people's attention, held up by the constant delivery of more attention, and the moment the attention stops, the structure reveals itself as having nothing underneath. Nietzsche said that the herd animal believes his happiness is identical with the happiness of everyone around him. Peter genuinely does not understand why the things that make him feel good do not make everyone around him feel equally good. When his schemes create chaos for Lois, or humiliation for Meg, or frustration for his friends, he is consistently surprised. Not because he is pretending, but because he cannot conceive of a perspective meaningfully different from his own. The herd animal cannot imagine genuine individuality in others because he does not possess it in himself. He thinks everyone wants what he wants. He thinks everyone sees what he sees. He thinks his tastes are universal, and his instincts are wisdom, and his comfort is the natural resting point that all reasonable people are aiming for. He is not being deliberately selfish. He is being structurally incapable of understanding that other people have an inner life as real and complex as his own, which would be a sad limitation if Peter actually had a complex inner life. But the herd animal does not have a complex inner life. He has reflexes dressed up as personality, and one of those reflexes, the deepest and most persistent one, is the reflex toward comfort and away from anything that disturbs it. Quote 3 We have been circling something in these first 4 sections. Peter cannot despise himself. Peter cannot choose a direction. Peter cannot conceive of genuine independence. All of these things describe what Peter lacks. But Nietzsche was also interested in what the last man produces in his place. When a person cannot build genuine self-respect, he tends to build something that looks like it from the outside. When he cannot achieve real power, he tends to exercise something that feels like power within reach. And the thing within easiest reach, for a man in Peter Griffin's position, is the person in his family with the least power of all. That is where the next section goes, and it is the part of Peter's Nietzsche profile that the show spends the most time demonstrating, even when it does not know it is demonstrating anything. Section 5, Ressentiment, Peter Griffin and the Art of Punching Down. There is a French word that Nietzsche borrowed and made famous because he felt no other word captured the specific thing he was describing. The word is ressentiment. It sounds like resentment, and it is related to resentment, but it is not quite the same thing. Regular resentment is when someone does something to you and you feel bitter about it. Ressentiment is something older and darker and more structural than that. It is the specific emotional poison that builds up in a person who cannot compete on the level where they feel they deserve to compete, and who eventually stops trying to rise and starts trying to bring things down instead. Nietzsche described it this way: the person filled with ressentiment cannot express their frustration directly at the things and people that are actually above them. They cannot beat the people who are genuinely better positioned, more talented, more powerful, more capable. So the frustration has to go somewhere else. It travels downward. It lands on whoever is nearest weakest and most vulnerable. And the person doing the punching does not experience this as cruelty. They experience it as their due. They experience it as finally getting something back from a world that has not given them enough. Peter Griffin punches down. He does it constantly, consistently, and with a specific and documented target. And the show, whether it intended this or not,
has built around that pattern a portrait of Nietzschean ressentiment that is almost too precise to be accidental. The target is Meg. Meg Griffin is Peter's oldest daughter. She is a teenage girl who, across the run of the show, wants recognizable and reasonable things. She wants to be liked at school. She wants her family to treat her with basic respect. She wants a boyfriend. She wants to feel like she belongs somewhere. These are not grand ambitions. They are the ordinary desires of an ordinary person trying to get through an ordinary adolescence. She is not exceptional. She is not powerful. She is, within the world of the show, about as low on the social ladder as anyone gets, and Peter cannot leave her alone. The abuse of Meg by Peter across the series is documented extensively, and is one of the most discussed aspects of the show among viewers and critics. It begins relatively mildly in the early seasons, where Peter is dismissive and occasionally cruel in ways that feel more like thoughtlessness than malice. But as the show progresses, particularly from season 8 onward, the treatment of Meg by her father escalates into something the show plays as comedy, but that looks, under any serious examination, like a man directing his entire accumulated frustration at the one person in his vicinity who cannot effectively fight back. Peter has farted on Meg's head. He has locked her out of the house during a hurricane in the hope that she would be killed. He has publicly humiliated her in ways that go beyond anything explained by thoughtlessness. In one episode, he actively works to destroy a relationship she has formed because her brief happiness disrupted his comfort. The show keeps returning to Meg as the object of Peter's cruelty, not because she has done anything to deserve it, but because she is available. She is the path of least resistance for everything Peter cannot direct upward. Now apply Nietzsche's framework to this, and watch how precisely it fits. Peter Griffin cannot compete with anyone who genuinely outranks him. His father-in-law, Carter Pewterschmidt, is wealthy, powerful, and openly contemptuous of Peter. Peter cannot beat him. He cannot outmaneuver him financially or socially. His best performances against Carter are small and lucky, and the power dynamic is never genuinely disturbed. Brian, the family dog, is more articulate than Peter, more educated than Peter, and more capable of sustained intellectual engagement than Peter. Peter cannot beat Brian in any domain that Brian has staked out as his own. Peter's neighbors include Joe Swanson, a police officer who, despite being disabled, maintains a level of professional competence and personal dignity that Peter does not approach. Even Quagmire, who is deeply flawed in his own ways, has a skill set, a personal code, and a level of self-awareness that exceeds Peter's. Peter is surrounded by people he cannot outperform, and one person he can. That person is Meg. Ressentiment does not announce itself as ressentiment. The person experiencing it does not say, "I am frustrated by my inability to rise, so I am going to redirect that frustration downward onto someone weaker." They do not have that level of self-awareness. What they feel instead is a kind of ambient justification, a background sense that the person below them somehow deserves what they are getting, that the cruelty is warranted, that the target has done something, or is something, that makes the treatment appropriate. Peter genuinely seems to believe, in whatever shallow way he believes anything, that Meg deserves his contempt. The show makes this explicit in multiple episodes. When Meg challenges him, when she asks for respect or pushes back against the way she is treated, Peter does not respond with guilt or recognition. He responds with irritation. She is bothering him. Her desire to be treated better is an inconvenience he has not signed up for. This is the ressentiment mindset in its clearest form. The person directing frustration downward experiences any resistance from the target as further provocation rather than as a legitimate response. Seahorse Seashell Party, Season 10, Episode 2, is the episode where all of this becomes unavoidable to examine. Meg's speech to her family, which covers Peter specifically, is a direct and accurate description of what he has done and what he is. She names specific behaviors. She names the pattern. She identifies clearly that she is the target of something that has nothing to do with her and everything to do with the people directing it at her. And then watch what Peter does. He does not hear it as truth. He hears it as attack. His response, that these are criticisms and Lois should make her stop, is the response of a person who experiences being accurately described as being personally assaulted. He is not angry at himself. He is annoyed at Meg for making him aware of himself. The ressentiment has so thoroughly reframed the relationship that even Meg's honest and reasonable pushback registers to Peter as something she is doing to him. The episode then reveals the structural truth underneath all of it. When Meg's pushback causes the family to turn on each other instead of
on her, everyone gets worse. The family's internal resentments, normally absorbed by Meg's presence as the designated target, flood the room. Peter falls apart. Lois falls apart. Chris falls apart. The removal of Meg as the lightning rod does not liberate anyone. It exposes how much dysfunction was being contained by having one person absorb it all. This is ressentiment's social function. When a group of people cannot process their frustrations honestly, they need somewhere to put them. The weakest member of the group becomes that somewhere, not through any conscious decision, but through the path of least resistance. Meg is weak enough socially that directing frustration at her carries no real cost. She cannot effectively retaliate. She cannot damage anyone standing. She is safe to target because she is too powerless to make targeting her expensive.
Peter did not decide to make Meg the family's punching bag through some calculated plan. He simply kept doing what was easiest, and Meg kept being the easiest thing. Ressentiment is not usually a decision. It is a habit. It forms in the space between genuine ambition, which requires real effort, and the need to feel powerful, which requires only a target. Look at the episodes where Peter forms a genuine connection with Meg. They exist, particularly in the earlier seasons. There are moments where Peter sees Meg clearly enough to feel something real for her, where he acts like a father rather than like a man relieving pressure through the nearest available outlet. These moments are significant for the essay's argument, not because they complicate the pattern, but because they confirm it. They show that Peter is capable of seeing Meg differently. He has the equipment. He simply defaults episode after episode to not using it, because using it would require him to redirect his ressentiment somewhere it would cost him more. The one person Peter cannot punch down at, the one person who is reliably below him in the family's social structure, is also the one person whose well-being would most improve if Peter made any effort at all. That is not a coincidence of storytelling. That is the ressentiment dynamic described in exact behavioral terms. Nietzsche was clear that ressentiment is not just a personal failing. It is what happens to a person who has stopped believing they can rise, and has converted that stopped belief into a way of living. Peter will not become more. He has made peace with not becoming more. Or rather, he has made the kind of peace with it that does not feel like peace from the inside, but that keeps the surface calm enough to function. And in that space between what he could be and what he is, between the genuine competition he cannot enter and the recliner he keeps returning to, Meg exists, available, unprotected, and expressing nothing that Peter needs to take seriously. The show has, in its later seasons, made this dynamic so extreme that it has crossed from uncomfortable comedy into something that critics and fans have repeatedly described as difficult to watch. The Flanderization of Peter's treatment of Meg, the escalation from thoughtless dismissal to active cruelty, tracks exactly with Nietzsche's description of what happens when ressentiment is never interrupted. It does not stay at one level, it grows, because the thing driving it is not satisfied by any single act of cruelty. The frustration that cannot go up always needs somewhere to go, and the only place available is down, and down is Meg. And so the pressure keeps building and keeps releasing in the same direction. There is one more thing the Meg dynamic reveals about Peter that matters for the essay's larger argument. Peter's ressentiment is aimed at Meg not just because she is weak, but because she wants things. She has genuine desires and genuine disappointments, and a genuine inner life that she expresses, however tentatively, in every episode. She reaches for things. She has a direction, however blocked. And something in Peter, something that cannot be named in any of the language Peter has access to, finds that reaching intolerable. The last man, Nietzsche said, cannot bear to see the people around him wanting more than he wants, because their wanting is an implicit criticism of his not wanting. Meg's desire for a better life is a mirror that Peter cannot look into, and so he does what the person filled with ressentiment always does when confronted with a mirror they cannot face. He breaks it, episode after episode, until she apologizes for holding it up. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What drives Peter toward Meg and away from everyone above him is the same emptiness that has been running through every section of this essay. The absence of genuine will, genuine direction, genuine ambition. We have named that absence in different ways across these sections, but Nietzsche had a specific term for what a person is supposed to have that Peter so clearly lacks. It is the thing that separates a life from an existence, and how completely Peter Griffin is missing it is where Section 6 goes next. Section 6. No will to power, just a will to Pawtucket. Nietzsche had a phrase he used to describe the fundamental drive that he believed existed in every living thing. He called it the will to power. And before anyone pictures a cartoon villain trying to take over the world, it is worth being very clear about what Nietzsche actually meant by it, because it has almost nothing to do with domination or control in the political sense. The will to power, as Nietzsche described it, is the drive to grow, the drive to become more than you currently are. The drive to push against whatever is resisting you and come out the other side stronger, more capable, more fully yourself. It is not about defeating other people. It is about defeating the smaller version of yourself. It is the thing inside a person that refuses to stay still, that reaches for the difficult thing instead of the easy thing, that builds, creates, strains, overcomes. Nietzsche believed this drive was the engine underneath all genuine human achievement. Art, philosophy, physical excellence, moral courage, creative work of any kind. All of it powered by the will to power in the sense he meant. The refusal to accept yourself as finished. The last man, the figure Nietzsche was warning about, is defined above everything else by the absence of this drive. The last man does not want to become more. He wants to stay comfortable. He does not push against resistance. He avoids it. He does not build anything that did not exist before. He maintains what he has inherited and calls the maintenance a life. The will to power has gone quiet in him, replaced by the will to stay warm, and the will to feel good, and the will to make it to tomorrow without anything being too hard today. Peter Griffin has no will to power. He has a will to Pawtucket Patriot Ale, a will to his recliner, a will to the drunken clam, and a will to whichever television program is currently on. And the show documents this not as a flaw that Peter struggles against, but as the settled and permanent condition of a man who has never seriously considered that it might be otherwise. Start with his work. Peter has held several jobs across the show's run. He worked at a toy factory owned by a man named Mr. Weed. When Mr. Weed died, Peter lost that job. He then worked briefly as a fisherman. He eventually ended up in a desk job at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery. None of these jobs were chosen in any meaningful sense. Peter did not sit down and think about what he wanted to do with his working life and then pursue it. He fell into each position through circumstances, stayed because leaving required effort, and performed at the level necessary to avoid being fired, which across the show's run has proven to be a remarkably low bar. His relationship with work is the will to power's total absence in its clearest form. Work, for Nietzsche, was one of the primary places where the will to power expressed itself. Not because work is inherently noble, but because genuine work requires a person to extend themselves towards something, to improve, to measure themselves against a standard and try to exceed it. Peter has never done this. His job at the brewery is a place he goes. It is not a place he builds anything. It is not a place he becomes anything. It is the location where he exchanges hours for money so that the hours at home can be purchased. Now look at his friendships. Peter has been close friends with Quagmire, Cleveland, and Joe for the entire run of the show. These relationships are consistent and warm in their own way, and it would be unfair to say they mean nothing to Peter. But examine what these friendships actually do. They do not push Peter toward anything. They do not challenge him. They do not ask anything of him that he would find genuinely difficult. The four of them sit at the bar, and the bar is the same, and the conversations are the same shape, and nobody leaves the drunken clam more capable than when they arrived. The friendships are comfortable. They are, in Nietzsche's framework, another expression of the will to stay still, dressed up as connection. Quagmire, who has become increasingly vocal across the show's later seasons about his actual feelings toward Peter, delivered one of the most thorough breakdowns of Peter's character in the season 8 episode called Jerome is the New Black. Quagmire tells Brian, in a long and specific speech, exactly why he dislikes him. But the interesting thing about that scene for this essay's purposes is not the content of Quagmire's complaints. It is the fact that Quagmire has clearly been watching Peter closely enough to have formed detailed opinions about him, and those opinions are not challenged by any evidence of Peter having grown or changed. Quagmire's frustration with Brian is specific and argued. His acceptance of Peter is something else entirely, something closer to the tolerance you extend to furniture. Peter is there. He has always been there. He will be there tomorrow, and nothing about tomorrow will be different from today. The will to power, when it is working in a person, produces direction. It produces the feeling that you are going somewhere, that the person you will be in 5 years is measurably different from the person you are now. It produces projects, commitments, relationships that require you to grow in order to maintain them. It produces a self that accumulates, that layers experiences into something deeper over time. Peter Griffin accumulates nothing. This is not an exaggeration. The show has a documented and well-known pattern where Peter learns a lesson at the end of an episode and begins the next episode having retained nothing from it. This pattern has been observed and written about extensively by people who study the show. It is called Aesop amnesia. And while it is partly a feature of how the show is structured, where each episode needs to begin from roughly the same starting point so the format can repeat, it is also, when you look at it through Nietzsche's lens, the most accurate possible description of a man with no will to power. Growth requires memory. Growth requires that the person you were yesterday is connected to the person you are today, and that the connection runs in a direction. If you cannot retain what you learned, you cannot build on it. If you cannot build on it, you cannot become anything.
anything.
Peter cannot become anything because the mechanism that would allow him to become anything, the accumulated understanding of his own experiences, is simply not there. Every episode he is new again. Every episode the lesson starts from scratch. He is a man in permanent first contact with every difficult thing, because nothing difficult ever sticks. His marriage to Lois is worth looking at carefully through this lens. In the early seasons, the relationship between Peter and Lois was written as something real. There were genuine moments of connection, genuine evidence that Peter understood something about Lois and valued it. There were episodes where Peter worked to do right by her, where the effort he made was visible and the emotion behind it was legible. These early moments matter because they show what Peter is capable of when the will to power is even faintly present, when some part of him is reaching towards something outside his own comfort. As the show progressed, those moments became rarer. The relationship calcified into a pattern where Lois manages and Peter demands, where Lois accommodates and Peter receives, where the partnership has been replaced by a dynamic in which one person is doing almost all of the work and the other person is doing almost none of it and seems genuinely unaware that this is the case. This is not a relationship maintained by two people who are both bringing the will to grow. This is a relationship maintained by one person while the other sits in the recliner. Lois, in this reading, becomes the person who provides the will to power that Peter does not have. She is the one who maintains the house, manages the children, negotiates with the world on the family's behalf, and keeps the whole structure from collapsing under the weight of Peter's inertia. This is not a small thing. It is the entire domestic infrastructure of the Griffin household running on one person's effort while the other person believes with complete sincerity that things are going fine. Nietzsche was specific about what a society looks like when the will to power disappears from the people inside it. He said, "The soil becomes poor, that nothing tall can grow in it anymore, that the conditions required to produce genuine greatness have been grazed down to nothing by the constant low pressure of people who want only to be comfortable." Peter Griffin's household is that soil. The children growing up inside it are growing up in an environment where the primary modeled behavior is the rejection of effort, the avoidance of difficulty, and the conversion of every available moment into an opportunity to feel good right now. Chris, Peter's son, across the show's run has become progressively less capable and less interesting as a character. Meg, Peter's daughter, has become progressively more beaten down. Stewie, the infant, is written as a genius specifically as a contrast to Peter, a demonstration of what potential looks like before the world around it has had time to grind it down. Brian, the dog, makes continuous attempts at the will to power, the novels he is writing, the intellectual positions he takes, the relationships he forms, and the show treats all of these attempts as objects of gentle mockery. The household's relationship with genuine ambition is one of suspicion and light contempt. This is the last man's cultural effect, which Nietzsche was perhaps most worried about. Not just that the last man fails to grow himself, but that the environment he creates makes it harder for anyone around him to grow either. Peter does not actively prevent growth in his family. He does not sit down and decide to clip everyone's wings. He simply fills the house with the atmosphere of a man who has never seriously wanted anything beyond the next comfortable hour, and that atmosphere is, over time, genuinely hard to breathe through if you want something more. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There is one specific test that Nietzsche proposed for figuring out whether a person has the will to power or its absence. It is a thought experiment, and it is probably the most revealing thing Nietzsche ever came up with. It does not require a doctor or an IQ test or a speech from a frustrated daughter. It just requires a question. And the answer to that question, when applied to Peter Griffin, tells you everything this essay has been building toward. That is exactly where Section 7 is going. Section 7, the eternal recurrence test. Would you live it again? Nietzsche came up with a lot of ideas across his career, but there is one that stands above the rest as a practical tool. Not a political idea or a historical argument, but something more personal than either of those things. Something that functions almost like a mirror you hold up to your own life and look into honestly. He called it the eternal recurrence, and the way it works is simple enough that you do not need to know anything about philosophy to feel its weight. Here is the idea. Imagine that a demon appears to you in your quietest moment, when you are alone and cannot distract yourself, and the demon tells you something. It tells you that the life you are currently living, this exact life, every moment of it, every choice, every day, every conversation, every hour spent doing what you do, is going to repeat. Not once, not twice, an infinite number of times. Every meal you have eaten, every relationship you have had, every morning you have woken up in the same bed and gone through the same routine, every boring afternoon and every painful moment and every small pleasure, all of it, exactly as it happened, again and again, forever, with no possibility of changing anything.
Nietzsche's question was, what is your reaction to that news? He was not asking whether the idea is scientifically true. He was not making a claim about how the universe actually works. He was using the idea as a test. Because the reaction a person has to this thought experiment tells you more about how they are living than almost anything else. If the thought fills you with horror, if the idea of living this life again, exactly as it is, feels like a punishment, then the life you are living is not the life you would choose if you were choosing freely. You are living it by default. You are drifting through it rather than inhabiting it. The demon's news is terrible to you because some part of you knows that this life, the one being proposed for infinite repetition, is not the one you actually wanted. If the thought does not horrify you, if you can hear the demon's announcement and feel something close to peace with it, or even genuine enthusiasm, then you are living in alignment with yourself. You have chosen your life, or at least chosen to own it, in a way that means the repetition is not a punishment but a confirmation. Nietzsche called the ability to say yes to this question the highest possible expression of how a person can relate to their own existence. He connected it to a Latin phrase, amor fati, which means love of fate. Not just accepting what happens to you, not just tolerating it, loving it, choosing it so completely that you would choose it again infinitely. The person who can genuinely say yes to the eternal recurrence is someone who has built a life through real intention. Not a perfect life, not a painless life, a chosen one. A life where the choices were made with enough awareness and enough genuine will that you can look back at them and say, that was me, I did that, I would do it again. Now ask the question about Peter Griffin. The eternal recurrence test applied to Peter Griffin does not require any guesswork. The show has essentially run the experiment for you. Because Family Guy, through its narrative structure, has already put Peter in the eternal recurrence. He is already living it. He lives the same life in every episode. He wakes up in the same house, sits in the same chair, drinks the same beer, goes to the same bar with the same friends, works at the same job, comes home, watches the same television, and starts over. The external details change from episode to episode. A new scheme, a new location, a new conflict. But the shape of it never changes. Peter's life is already on infinite repeat. The show's reset structure, which returns him to the starting position at the end of every episode, has accidentally built the eternal recurrence into the architecture of his existence. And the question the test asks is not whether Peter notices this. He does not. The question is whether, if he did notice, he would be at peace with it. He would not. And the evidence for this is built into the show in ways that the writers may not have intended to make as revealing as they are. Every single episode of Family Guy is driven by Peter's dissatisfaction with something about his current situation. He is bored, he feels disrespected, he wants something he does not have, he is frustrated by a rule or a person or a circumstance that is standing between him and what he wants right now. If Peter were genuinely at peace with his life, if he had the kind of relationship with his existence that the eternal recurrence test points toward, he would not spend every episode being driven by the itch of wanting something different. The itch is the tell. It reveals that underneath the surface contentment, underneath the beer and the recliner and the comfortable routine, there is a person who has not made peace with anything. He has only stopped fighting long enough to feel okay for a while. This matters because it separates Peter from something the show sometimes implies he is. He is not a man who is content. He is a man who is comfortable. These are not the same thing. Contentment is the product of genuine engagement with your life. It is what you feel when you have done the thing you set out to do, when you have been present for the life you are actually in. Comfort is what you feel when you have successfully avoided the things that would disturb you. Contentment is earned. Comfort is arranged. Peter has arranged himself an enormously comfortable existence and has no contentment at all, which is why every episode he needs something new to chase. Nietzsche said that the eternal recurrence is the heaviest possible thought. The person who cannot bear it is the person who has been sleepwalking. Not necessarily unhappy, not necessarily aware of the sleepwalking, but operating at a level of engagement with their own life that, if suddenly made visible, would reveal itself as deeply insufficient. Peter Griffin is sleepwalking through a life he has never actually chosen. He ended up married to Lois through the circumstances of their meeting. He ended up with children through the natural result of being married. He ended up at the brewery through the sequence of jobs that happened to him. He ended up in the house on Spooner Street because that is where everything landed. At no point in the documented history of Peter Griffin has he sat down and made a real choice about the direction of his life. Things happened to him. He responded to them. He settled into whatever arrangement resulted. And then he defended that arrangement loudly and confidently, as though he had built it. The eternal recurrence test exposes this because it forces the question, would you build it again? Not, would you passively end up here again, which is almost certain given how little Peter steers. Would you actively choose this? Would you, knowing everything you now know, sit down at the beginning and design this life on purpose? The honest answer, which Peter would never give and possibly cannot access, is no. He would not choose to be a man whose daughter has told him he is a waste of a man, and whom he could not hear. He would not choose to be a man whose wife manages everything while he sits in a chair. He would not choose to be a man with an IQ of 70 who has accomplished nothing and is heading nowhere. He has not chosen any of this. He has simply never gotten around to choosing anything else. Nietzsche connected the eternal recurrence to the idea of amor fati, loving your fate, and this phrase is often misread as a suggestion to be passive, to accept whatever happens and call it good. But that is not what Nietzsche meant at all. Loving your fate does not mean loving whatever you happen to have stumbled into. It means living so fully inside your own genuine choices that when fate delivers the consequences of those choices, you can meet them with something other than resentment or resignation. You can meet them with recognition. That was mine. I chose that. I stand behind it. Peter Griffin cannot do this. He cannot stand behind anything he has done because he did not stand in front of anything long enough to really do it. His life is not the product of his choices. It is the product of his defaults. And defaults cannot be loved in the way Nietzsche meant. They can only be habituated. They can only be made familiar enough that the discomfort of looking at them directly is managed by the comfort of not looking at all. The show gives you the clearest possible evidence of this in how Peter responds to moments where the eternal recurrence is briefly interrupted. When something genuinely new enters his life, when a circumstance arrives that the recliner and the beer and the bar cannot immediately absorb, Peter does not rise to meet it. He panics, schemes, makes things worse, and then waits for the situation to resolve itself so he can return to the established pattern. This is not the behavior of a man who has chosen his life. It is the behavior of a man who has arranged his life so carefully around comfort that any disruption of that comfort is experienced as a threat rather than an opportunity. Nietzsche said the person who can embrace the eternal recurrence has, in some sense, already become the Übermensch. Not because the test is easy, but because passing it requires a kind of wholehearted engagement with your own existence that most people spend their lives avoiding. Peter Griffin fails the test, not because his life is objectively bad. Lives much harder than his have been embraced with genuine love by people who built them with genuine intention. He fails it because his life was never built. It accumulated. And the difference between a built life and an accumulated one is exactly the difference between the person Nietzsche admired and the person Nietzsche warned us about. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There is one more angle on Peter's relationship with the eternal recurrence that the show makes visible, and it is the one that connects most directly to the next section. Because Peter's life being on repeat is not just a feature of his psychology, it is a feature of the show itself, and the show's decision to keep deepening Peter's worst qualities across its run, to keep pushing him further from the early version of himself that had some genuine warmth and some genuine growth, is not accidental. It is the show enacting, season by season, exactly what Nietzsche said would happen to the last man when nothing interrupted his slide. That is where Section 8 is going, and it is the part of this argument that changes how you watch the show entirely. Section 8. The Flanderization of the Last Man. There is a term that television critics and dedicated viewers use when a character in a long-running show slowly loses everything that made them a real person and becomes only the loudest, most exaggerated version of one single trait. The term is Flanderization. It comes from Ned Flanders, the neighborly Christian man from The Simpsons, who started out as a genuinely written character with depth and warmth, and eventually became nothing but a walking collection of religious quirks. The original person disappeared. What remained was a caricature of one feature of the original person, repeated and amplified until it was all that was left. Peter Griffin is the most documented case of Flanderization in American animated television. This is not a fringe opinion. It is the consensus of critics, longtime viewers, and people who study the show seriously. The early Peter and the later Peter are so different from each other that the show itself has had characters acknowledge the gap. And the specific direction of Peter's Flanderization, the precise way in which he got worse rather than better over time, maps onto Nietzsche's description of the last man with an accuracy that is genuinely difficult to explain as coincidence. Nietzsche did not describe the last man as a fixed state. He described it as a direction. A society moving toward the last man does not arrive there all at once. It drifts. It loses things gradually. The ambitions get smaller. The tolerance for difficulty gets lower. The capacity for genuine feeling gets thinner. The horizon gets closer. And this process, Nietzsche said, does not stop at any comfortable middle point. It keeps going. The soil keeps getting poorer. The conditions for anything tall keep deteriorating. There is no floor to the descent, because the descent is powered by the same force that drives it to begin with, the preference for comfort over growth, which gets stronger as the growing gets harder. Watch what happens to Peter Griffin across the show's run, and you are watching this process in real time. Season 1 Peter is recognizably human. He is dim and loud and frequently selfish, but the show frames these qualities with enough warmth and enough consequence that Peter reads as a real person rather than a collection of behaviors. There are moments in the first season where Peter is genuinely moved by his family. There are moments where he works to be better, where the effort is visible and the love underneath it is legible. The episode where he tries to connect with Meg, the moments where his relationship with Lois is written as something both of them are genuinely invested in. The scenes where his friendship with his neighbors has the texture of real affection rather than just shared proximity. These are not accidental. The show was, in its early seasons, writing a character. By season 4, something has shifted. The episode Petarded, which this essay has returned to multiple times, is significant not only for what it shows about Peter's self-knowledge, but for what it signals about the show's direction. The TV Tropes entry for that episode contains a specific note that describes Petarded as the moment where Peter officially transitions from a dim-witted but well-meaning, bumbling father to something darker. The writers made a choice. The warmth started going out of the character, and the chaos started increasing to fill the space the warmth had occupied. By season 8, the transition is complete. The Peter Griffin of season 8 onward is a fundamentally different person from the Peter Griffin of the first 3 seasons, and the difference is not subtle. He has become, as documented exhaustively by people who study the show, a man who does things that are not explainable by stupidity alone. He actively harms people. He shows no remorse for harm he has caused, even when it is pointed out directly. He does things to his family that the early seasons would have treated as the low point of a very bad episode and then addressed. In the later seasons, these things happen and the show moves on. The list of what Peter does in the later seasons, documented across multiple episodes, includes things that no amount of comedy framing fully absorbs. He locks Meg out of the house during a hurricane in Seahorse Seashell Party, with what the episode suggests is a genuine hope that she will not survive it. He attempts in one episode to marry his own son Chris for financial reasons. He shoots Joe in the eye with a BB gun. He shoots Quagmire in the throat. He destroys property, endangers lives, and causes serious harm to people he is supposed to love. And the show's response is to either play it for shock value or simply move past it without resolution. This escalation is the show's Flanderization of Peter. But it is also, looked at through Nietzsche's lens, something more interesting than a creative failure. It is the show accidentally demonstrating exactly what Nietzsche said would happen to the last man when nothing interrupted his drift. Nietzsche was clear that the last man does not stay still. The passivity is not a stable resting point. It is a slope. Because the last man's defining feature is the rejection of anything difficult and maintaining any kind of genuine human relationship is difficult, the last man's relationships gradually hollow out as he sheds the parts of himself that relationships require. The capacity for empathy requires effort. The capacity for patience requires effort. The capacity to see another person clearly and respond to what you actually see rather than what is most convenient requires enormous effort. The last man, committed to avoiding effort, loses these capacities over time, not through any dramatic choice, but through consistent neglect. This is Peter's arc across the show's seasons. He does not wake up one day and decide to become crueler. He simply keeps choosing comfort over connection, choosing ease over effort, choosing the path of least resistance in every situation. And each of those choices erodes a little more of whatever genuine feeling was there at the beginning. By the time the show reaches its later seasons, the erosion is so advanced that what remains is not really a person in the full sense. It is a set of drives wearing a person's shape. The drive toward comfort, the drive away from accountability, the drive to extract pleasure from the nearest available source and move on before anything gets complicated. The show's writers have described the Flanderization in interviews as a response to audience demand. The more extreme Peter got, the more certain segments of the audience responded. The shock value worked as a ratings mechanism. The escalation kept getting rewarded, and so the escalation kept happening. This is itself a Nietzschean observation, because what the audience was responding to and rewarding was the increasing purity of the last man. They did not want the complicated early Peter who felt things and worked to be better. They wanted the simple later Peter who did outrageous things for immediate laughs and never had to reckon with any of it. The audience was, in their consumption of the show, performing their own version of the choice Nietzsche's crowd made when Zarathustra showed them the last man and they cheered. The specific direction of Peter's Flanderization matters for this argument. He did not become meaner in the way that a person who had developed a coherent worldview might become meaner. He became emptier. The cruelty of later Peter is not the cruelty of conviction. It is the cruelty of absence.
absence. There is nobody home making decisions about what to do. There is only a large man moving toward whatever feels best right now, and away from whatever does not, and the people in his path are simply in his path. Nietzsche predicted this emptiness. He said the last man's society would eventually become too barren to produce great individuals, because the soil that great individuals needed had been grazed down to nothing. He was talking about culture broadly, but the Griffin household is a working model of the same process in miniature. The children growing up inside it, Meg, Chris, and Stewie, are growing up in an environment where the primary adult male is demonstrating, episode after episode and season after season, that nothing is worth the effort of becoming it, that comfort is the goal, that accountability is optional, that the people around you are resources for your immediate satisfaction, rather than people whose inner lives have the same weight as your own. Meg, under this influence, has become progressively more defeated. Chris, under this influence, has become progressively less capable. The show frames both of these trajectories as comedy, but they are also the predictable output of an environment run by a man whose Flanderization has removed everything from him except the drive toward his own comfort and the drive away from anything that disturbs it. The early seasons of Family Guy contained something the later seasons have almost entirely lost. They contained the possibility that Peter might change. Not the certainty, not even the likelihood, but the genuine possibility, kept alive by the occasional moment of warmth or genuine feeling, that the man in the recliner was still in there somewhere, and might, given the right circumstance, be reached. The later seasons have removed that possibility almost completely. There is no moment in the season 15 or season 16 Peter Griffin that suggests a different version of him is waiting to emerge. The Flanderization has closed off that exit. What remains is the last man in his final form, stable, sealed, comfortable, going nowhere forever. Nietzsche said the last man lives longest, not because he is healthy, but because he has removed from his life everything that might kill him early, including the things that make life worth living long enough to matter: risk, genuine love, real commitment, the possibility of failure in the pursuit of something that actually mattered. Peter Griffin will be on television for as long as the show runs. He will be in his recliner. He will have his beer. Nothing will have changed. He will have outlasted every version of himself that might have become something, and the show will keep going, and the audience will keep watching. __quote_7___. But the audience's role in all of this is not something the essay has fully examined yet. Because the show's Flanderization of Peter does not happen in a vacuum. It happens in response to an audience that kept rewarding it. And the question of why millions of people watched Peter Griffin get worse and worse and found it not just tolerable, but entertaining, is not a question about Family Guy. It is a question about all of us. And it is exactly the question that Section 9 is built to answer. Section 9, the herd's lightning rod, what Peter does to the people around him. Nietzsche had a specific and unsettling prediction about what the world would look like once the last man became the dominant type. He did not predict violence. He did not predict open conflict or dramatic collapse. What he predicted was something quieter and in some ways harder to fight. He predicted that the last man's world would flatten everything, that it would press down on anyone who stuck up above the general level, that it would not tolerate difference or ambition or genuine individuality, because those things made the last man uncomfortable in a way he could not name but could not ignore. And the pressure applied to anyone who reached for something more would not come from a government or an institution. It would come from inside the group itself, from the people nearest to you, from your own family. This is not an abstract prediction. It is playing out in the Griffin household in every single episode of Family Guy. And the person it is playing out on most visibly, most consistently, and most revealingly is the same person this essay has returned to in almost every section. Not because she is the show's most interesting character, though she might be, but because of what her position in the family reveals about the structure that Peter's last man existence has built around itself. Meg Griffin is the lightning rod. This is not a metaphor the essay is inventing. The show itself uses this exact framing in Seahorse Seashell Party, Season 10, Episode 2. At the end of that episode, Meg watches what happens when she temporarily removes herself as the family's target. She delivers her speech. She names what Peter is, and what Lois is, and what Chris does. And the family, deprived of their lightning rod, turns on each other. The dysfunction that Meg had been absorbing, the accumulated frustration and resentment and dissatisfaction that the family had been directing at her because she was the safest target, floods the room with nowhere to go. And the family falls apart almost immediately. Meg watches this happen. And then she makes the decision that the show frames as wisdom, and that Nietzsche would have identified as the last man's world doing exactly what he said it would do. She takes it back. She apologizes. apologizes. She reassumes her position as the person who absorbs what the family cannot process. She becomes the lightning rod again, so that everyone else can be comfortable. The show presents this as Meg being selfless, as Meg recognizing that her role, however painful, serves a purpose. But look at what that reading actually requires you to accept. It requires you to accept that the correct response to being treated cruelly by the people who are supposed to love you is to absorb the cruelty indefinitely, so that those people do not have to confront it. It requires you to accept that Meg's value to the family is her capacity to be hurt by them without the hurt having any lasting consequence. It requires you to accept that the family's comfort is more important than Meg's dignity. This is Nietzsche's flattening pressure made into a family dynamic. Meg reaches for something more. She asks to be seen. She asks to be treated as a person whose inner life has the same weight as anyone else's. And the family's response, the collective response of the group, is to make her feel that the reaching itself was the problem. That wanting more than what she has been given is the disruption. That the correct and reasonable and good thing to do is to stop reaching and go back to absorbing. The last man's world does not need walls or guards to keep people from reaching for something higher. It needs only the accumulated weight of the people closest to you treating your ambition as a problem. Meg does not need to be locked up. She just needs to be treated, episode after episode, as though the thing that would improve her life is not available and her wanting it is somehow rude. And because the people doing this to her are her family, the people whose approval she needs most and whose rejection costs her most, the pressure works. She goes back. Every time, she goes back. The other children in the Griffin household are worth examining through this lens as well. Chris Griffin, Peter's son, has followed a trajectory that the show documents but does not examine. In the early seasons, Chris is a teenage boy with some specific qualities. He is a talented artist. This is mentioned multiple times in the show's early run, and is treated as a genuine characteristic, something real about who Chris is. He has an eye for things. He creates. He has a direction that is his own, even if it is undeveloped. By the show's later seasons, Chris's artistic talent has essentially disappeared from the writing. What remains is a character defined almost entirely by a small number of crude traits, most of them inherited from or reflective of Peter.
He is less capable than he was in the early seasons. He is less interesting. He has shed the specific quality, the artistic vision that made him distinct from his father, and has drifted toward a version of Peter that is younger and slightly less loud. The soil Nietzsche described, the one that gets poorer under the last man's influence, has worked on Chris in exactly the way Nietzsche said it would. The thing in him that reached for something has been grazed down to nothing. Stewie Griffin is the counterpoint the show built in from the beginning, and he is worth understanding in this context because he reveals, by contrast, what the household is doing to everyone inside it. Stewie is an infant who is written as a genius. He speaks in full sentences. He builds weapons. He has designed and operated a time machine. He has an enormous vocabulary and a fully formed aesthetic sense and genuine creative ambition. The show plays this as absurdist comedy, and it is, but the specific joke being made is significant. The most intellectually capable and genuinely ambitious person in the Griffin household is the one who has been alive the shortest amount of time. He has not yet been fully processed by the environment. He has not yet had enough time for the pressure to work on him the way it has worked on Meg and Chris. The show does not make this argument explicitly, but the structure of the family makes it for you. The longer a person has been inside the Griffin household, the more they have been ground down toward the general level. Meg is the oldest child and the most defeated. Chris is the middle child and noticeably less capable than he started. Stewie is the youngest and still reaching for things. The pattern is not subtle once you see it. Brian Griffin, the talking dog, is the character who makes the most sustained and visible attempts at genuine ambition in the show. He writes, he reads, he engages with ideas, he forms relationships and tries to maintain them. He reaches, repeatedly and with varying levels of sincerity, towards something more than the comfortable routine of the Griffin household. And the show's treatment of Brian is one of the most revealing things about how the household, and by extension, the show itself, relates to anyone who reaches. Brian's attempts at ambition are treated as comedy. His novels are failures. His romantic relationships collapse. His intellectual positions are mocked, sometimes by the show's own characters, and sometimes by the show's structure, which places him in situations that undercut whatever genuine point he is making. He is, across the show's run, never allowed to actually become the thing he is reaching for. Every attempt ends in some form of deflation. And the show frames this deflation as funny rather than as sad, which is the last man's response to genuine ambition described in narrative terms. The person who reaches
reaches is the person who falls, and the falling is for your entertainment. This is Nietzsche's prediction about the last man's world at its most specific. Nobody in that world needs to be stopped forcefully from becoming something. They just need to be surrounded by an environment where every attempt to become something results in deflation and gentle mockery, and the suggestion, delivered through laughter rather than through cruelty, that the reaching was the funny part, that the correct response to ambition is to find it amusing, that the person reaching for something higher is providing the group with entertainment at their own expense. Peter does not organize this. He is not coordinating a campaign against anyone's growth. He is simply the gravitational center of a household that has organized itself around his comfort, and everything in that household has been shaped by proximity to that center. He pulls things toward his level not through force, but through the constant, gentle pressure of being the person everyone else has had to adapt to. Lois adapts to manage what he will not manage. Meg adapts to absorb what he generates. Chris adapts toward the version of masculinity Peter models. Brian adapts by being the voice of reason that Peter consistently ignores, which means Brian's voice of reason serves Peter's comfort by existing without ever actually changing anything. The household is, in this reading, a closed system designed to sustain one person's comfort at the expense of everyone else's growth. Not designed consciously, not designed at all, in fact. It evolved. It evolved through years of small adaptations made by people who had to live with Peter, and who found, through trial and error, that adapting to him was less costly than fighting him. The system that resulted looks, from the outside, like a functioning family. It has the shape of one. It contains the right number of people in the right relationships. But the function it is actually performing is not the function families are supposed to perform. It is not producing people who grow. It is producing people who survive proximity to someone who does not grow, which is a different thing entirely. Nietzsche said the last man's world was one where whoever thinks differently goes voluntarily into the madhouse, not because they are locked up, but because the social pressure of being different in a world that has decided sameness is the goal is eventually heavy enough that the person who is different starts to wonder if the difference is the problem. Meg wonders this. She has been told, through the consistent behavior of her family across 20-plus seasons of television, that her desire to be treated differently is the disruption, that the family's equilibrium, which requires her to be the target, is more important than her actual well-being. And she keeps coming back to that position because the alternative, holding her ground and watching the family collapse, feels like something she is causing rather than something she is refusing to absorb anymore. That dynamic, that specific and painful dynamic, is what the last man's world produces when it is working correctly. And Peter Griffin, sitting in his recliner, completely unaware that any of this is happening, is the engine of it. Not through malice, through the specific and complete absence of anything that would make him aware of what his comfort is costing. Quote 8 __. There is one final piece of this argument that the essay has been saving, because everything covered in sections 1 through 9 describes what Peter Griffin is and what he does and what it costs the people around him. What has not yet been fully examined is what it means that we love him for it, that we watch, that we have always watched, that the audience has not recoiled from Peter Griffin across 25 years of television, but has embraced him, memed him, made him one of the most recognizable figures in American popular culture. That is the argument Section 10 was always building toward, and it is the one that implicates all of us. Section 10, why we love him anyway, and why that's the warning. There is a moment in Nietzsche's book Thus Spoke Zarathustra that this entire essay has been moving toward. Zarathustra has come down from the mountain. He has tried to share his ideas about what human beings could become. The crowd has laughed at him, so he tries a different approach. He describes the last man in as much detail as he can. He paints the picture slowly and honestly. The small pleasures, the small pains, the comfort, the blinking, the life that goes nowhere and asks nothing and produces nothing and repeats until it is over. He describes this to the crowd, expecting them to feel what he feels when he looks at it. He expects them to feel the pull of something better, the desire to be more than what the last man is. He expects the portrait to work as a warning. The crowd does not react with horror. They do not feel the pull of something better. They cheer. They say, make us into this. Give us the last man. You can keep the Übermensch, the higher ideal, the difficult and demanding version of what a person could be. We want the last man. We want the beer and the recliner and the routine and the comfort. We want the life that goes nowhere, because a life that goes nowhere is a life that cannot fail. Zarathustra is devastated by this. He had come to the crowd out of something like love. He wanted to give them something real, and they heard everything he
said and chose the comfortable thing anyway. Family Guy premiered on Fox on January 31st, 1999. It was canceled twice, in 2000 and again in 2002, and was brought back both times by audience demand. The DVD sales of the canceled seasons were so strong that Fox reversed its decision and renewed the show. The audience wanted it back. Not a different show, not a better version, this show, with this man, in this recliner. As of the time this essay was written, Family Guy has run for more than 20 seasons. It has produced over 400 episodes. Peter Griffin is one of the most recognized animated characters on the planet. His image appears on merchandise sold in countries that have never aired the show. His voice is recognizable to people who have seen only clips. His specific laugh, a sound that the show uses as its own punctuation mark, is embedded in the shared memory of an entire generation of television viewers. The memes alone tell a story worth examining. Peter Griffin has generated some of the most widely shared and longest-lasting meme formats in internet history. The one where he explains that something grinds his gears. The one where he and the giant chicken fight through an entire city. The clips of him doing something absurd that circulate years after the episode aired. These memes travel so far and last so long, not because they are the funniest things ever put on screen, but because they are immediately and universally legible. Everyone knows who Peter Griffin is. Everyone knows how he operates. Everyone recognizes him. And this recognition is not the recognition of seeing something foreign and strange. It is the recognition of seeing something familiar. When people share Peter Griffin memes, when they quote him, when they laugh at what he does, there is something underneath the laughter that is closer to identification than to mockery. He is funny because he is recognizable. He is recognizable because he is, in some form or another, everywhere. He is your neighbor. He is your coworker. He is, in the specific and uncomfortable way that the best comedy characters always are, a version of something you have seen in yourself on the days when you were not trying very hard to be better. This is the thing Nietzsche's crowd understood before Zarathustra did. The last man is not repellent. He is comfortable. He is easy to be around because he asks nothing of you. He does not make you feel inadequate by being exceptional. He does not challenge you by reaching for something that makes your own stillness visible by contrast. He sits in his chair and he drinks his beer and he is fine. And being around someone who is fine is a relief, when the alternative is being around someone who is constantly straining towards something difficult and making you aware, by proximity, of everything you are not straining toward. Peter Griffin is beloved in part because watching him requires nothing from you. He does not ask you to grow. He does not ask you to reflect. He does not ask you to feel anything complicated or sit with anything uncomfortable for longer than the joke takes to land. He creates chaos, and it resolves, and nothing changes, and nobody grows, and you can watch it for 22 minutes and feel entertained without feeling challenged. This is comfort delivery at an industrial scale. This is the last man selling himself to an audience that is, in significant numbers, also made of last men, or last men in training, or people who are tired enough on a Tuesday night that the last man's offer is the one that sounds best. The show has known this about its audience for a long time. The later seasons, in which Peter becomes progressively more extreme and the reset becomes more total, are in some ways the show responding to the data. The audience rewarded the comfort. The audience rewarded the absence of consequence. The audience rewarded the escalating shock value that allowed them to feel something without having to think about anything. And so the show gave them more of it. The Flanderization of Peter is not just a creative choice. It is a market response. Peter got worse because getting worse worked. Because the audience that Nietzsche described, the crowd that cheered for the last man, kept cheering. This is not a comfortable thing to say. It is not the kind of point that makes people feel good about themselves. But it is the point that the evidence supports, and it is the point that gives the essay its teeth. Because everything covered in the previous 9 sections describes what Peter Griffin is. This section is about what it means that we made him a star. Nietzsche was not warning about Peter Griffin specifically. He could not have been. He died in 1900, a full century before the show premiered. But he was warning about exactly the cultural appetite that Peter Griffin feeds. He was warning about a world in which the ideal of the comfortable, undemanding, contentedly going nowhere man became not a cautionary figure, but an aspirational one. Not a warning, but a mascot. And Family Guy has, across its run, functioned as a mascot factory. Peter's image, his laugh, his specific brand of loud, comfortable inertia has been packaged and distributed and consumed by an audience that finds in him not a mirror held up critically, but a mirror that makes them feel okay about what they see. Watching Peter is, for a significant portion of his audience, an experience that does not disturb. It confirms. It says,
says, "This is fine. The recliner is fine. The beer is fine. Not reaching for anything is fine. The life you are currently living without interrogating it is fine." That confirmation is worth something to people. It is worth enough that they brought the show back from cancellation twice. It is worth enough that over 400 episodes have been produced and consumed. It is worth enough that Peter Griffin's face is on products being sold right now in stores that have nothing to do with television. Nietzsche's crowd did not cheer for The Last Man because they were stupid. They cheered because the alternative Zarathustra was offering was hard. The Übermensch, the higher ideal, the person who creates meaning and grows through difficulty and takes genuine risks and earns genuine love and builds a genuine self through sustained and honest effort, is not an easy thing to want to be. It is demanding and uncomfortable, and there is no guarantee that the effort will produce anything you can hold on to. The Last Man at least delivers. The comfort is real, even if it is small. The beer is cold, even if the life is empty. The recliner is soft, even if nothing is being built. Choosing The Last Man over the Übermensch is not an irrational choice. It is the rational choice for someone who has stopped believing that the effort required for the other thing is worth what it might produce. And that loss of belief, that quiet giving up on the possibility of something more, is exactly what Nietzsche was mourning when he wrote The Last Man into existence. Peter Griffin is what you get when that giving up is not just personal, but cultural. When it is shared by enough people that it stops feeling like giving up and starts feeling like a lifestyle. When it is packaged into a television show and sold back to the people living it as entertainment. When the crowd cheers loudly enough that the show gets renewed twice and runs for over 20 seasons and generates hundreds of millions of dollars and puts a man who cannot despise himself on merchandise sold around the world. Zarathustra came down from his mountain to share something he loved. The crowd heard it and chose the comfortable thing instead. The show has been running for a long time now, and the crowd is still choosing. And Peter Griffin, in his recliner, with his beer, going nowhere at full volume, blinks. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.